how the people are doing. So today we have the camera comparison between the X60 Pro Plus and the iPhone 12. Now many consider the iPhone 12 series as a whole to be the best videography cameras out there, so let's find out how well the X60 can compare and whether or not it might actually be able to take an upper hand. We'll see. We'll start off with the front cameras. Alright, so here we have the front camera videos from both of these. 4K on the iPhone, as you already know. You can go up to 4K 60, by the way. It loses out a little bit dynamic range, but that's about the only downside to it. But on the X60, 1080p, so that's a huge downside in my opinion. And secondly, it would appear that the dynamic range also isn't as good compared to the iPhone, at least on the viewfinder. Now, this has been kind of a trend, you know, the X60 hasn't been particularly good with front camera video, especially like compared to something like the iPhone, which is, by the way, one of the best, if not the best video camera out there for front cameras. Well, it's not looking particularly great. So yeah, as I said right there, not a particularly great start for the X60. 1080p 30. Bad dynamic range compared to the iPhone. I think the only place where the X60 takes a small little upper hand is in white balance, because the iPhone really likes to warm up skin tones and give them a bunch of saturation. The skin tone looks pretty nice on the iPhone, but white balance is a tiny little win for the X60. But otherwise, yeah, I think the iPhone's gonna take a nice little win right here. Anyways, let's move on to the rear cameras, because here things might be a little bit different. So initially you could see right there that the X60 can blow out a lot of highlights compared to the iPhone. That could also be because it has a much higher contrast usually. Now in some cases the higher contrast looks very nice, but in this case it's not particularly good because of the lighting situation. The sun being behind the leaves is not exactly playing in the X60's favor. As for colors, I actually prefer it on the X60. It's a little bit more saturated than the most natural look. I think the iPhone is closer to natural, but the extra saturation can help out a lot. So dynamic range overall can vary a little, but I would say the iPhone handles the exposure and dynamic range the most consistently. As for versatility, well, we can zoom in 2 times, but we cannot zoom out to the ultra wide on the X60. On the iPhone you can do that. You obviously don't have any telephoto cameras, but being able to switch to the ultra wide while recording is quite nice. On the X60 that's not exactly an option, so here's the dedicated ultra wide 4K. And I do think that the stabilization on the X60 is slightly better. A few jerks here and there are making it into the shot on the iPhone, versus the X60 handling them just a tad bit better. It has a gimbal stabilization system, so I did expect it to be better, but you know, it's not the biggest difference in the world. What is a pretty big difference right here is just how much the shadows are getting crushed. It could be a combination of not particularly great HDR and the higher contrast, so overall I do think dynamic range is gonna be a win for the iPhone here. Now the X60 also sports an HDR mode. This isn't HDR 10 Plus, we'll get to that in a moment, but here, well, now actually dynamic range looks really good on the X60. The only problem here is that you cannot use this particular HDR mode with the ultra-wide camera. So on the ultra-wide you're stuck with the high contrast and really crushed shadows and stuff like that. On the main cameras, however, it's looking really nice, and as for colors, it's actually more accurate on the X60. Now 4K 60, well, this is kind of surprising, because you can see that stabilization isn't perfect on either of these, but it's pretty damn usable on the X60 in particular. Now if you had watched my previous video where I compared the X60 to the OnePlus 9 Pro in terms of video, you'd know that 4K 60 was utterly mortifying on the X60. I'll throw in the clip that I took for the OnePlus's camera comparison, and you'll see that there's a huge difference. I'm not sure if an update happened or not that could have improved it, but you know, it's nice to see that 4K 60 is pretty good. Also dynamic range, as you saw right there, definitely better on the iPhone. Now 4K 60 with the ultra wide. Well, once again the stabilization is amazing on the X60. That wasn't the case when I took the sample shots for the OnePlus versus X60's video comparison. So I'm not sure what particularly changed, but it's nice to see that the X60 has suddenly managed to improve. But anyways, overall once again dynamic range is better on the iPhone here. That's pretty much expected, and stabilization, not a huge difference, but I do see a few more jerks on the iPhone. But again, Very, very small difference. So yeah, overall 4K 60 is a lot more usable now compared to one comparison that I did before, so that's something, I guess. But anyways, I think 4K 60 still is better on the iPhone because of the better dynamic range. Now 8K, well, in 8K you do definitely lose out on stabilization. That's been consistent across the two comparisons I've done for the X60 here. Dynamic range is also affected, and I do think the iPhone, obviously with 4K, is doing a much better job in handling the highlights. So yeah, that's something. And well, overall 8K isn't all that great on the X60. There are better phones out there that can do 8K much better, with much better stabilization in particular. Now for a pretty harsh condition with a studio light acting as a backlight, and in this case the X60 is actually doing a really good job. There's a very good reason for it. The X60 has much higher contrast compared to the iPhone, which just removes all that faded look while also maintaining a lot of the highlights. Now granted, the X60 isn't controlling the highlights like on the table and stuff like that as well as the iPhone, but overall I think Valentine looks better. The colors are a lot more accurate, and it just looks better in this case, like given how harsh the condition was. Now focusing as a whole, I felt like it was a little bit faster on the iPhone, but it's not a huge difference. As for the ultra-wide cameras, well, it's pretty much a similar story. Higher contrast on the X60 looks really nice in this case. It is obviously blowing out some of the highlights like on the table and stuff like that. But overall, Valentine does look better and a lot more detailed on the X60. The iPhone's ultra-wide camera for some reason is giving a very soft image compared to the X60. It's pretty noticeable, but yeah, I do think I'm gonna go with the X60 here once again. Now as for the HDR modes, there's HDR 10 Plus on the X60 versus Dolby Vision on the iPhone. Now I do think the iPhone's dynamic range in Dolby Vision is a little bit better compared to the X60's HDR 10 Plus. But overall, both are doing pretty well here. Both have amazing colors, and given how, crazy the lighting situation was with warm light on one side and normal fill light on the other, I would say both are handling the situation very well. White balance is very accurate. Both are maintaining the warmth that is falling on Valentine's feathers really well as well. But the problem that I've noticed with the X60 is that it just starts flickering all of a sudden whenever there's a direct backlight, like in this case. Now trust me, that ring light back there, that light has no flickering problems. You'll see soon enough why I say that. But yeah, this problem of flickering, it seems to be very particular in the HDR modes, so to keep that in mind. And here, same thing on the iPhone. You can see no flickering, nothing at all. It looks absolutely perfect over here. I will say this, the higher contrast on the X60 once again made the scene look a lot less faded than the iPhone, but man, that flickering was devastating. Now for low light video, well, both of these do have a fair amount of noise in the background, but I gotta say, the X60 looks really, really detailed. Like, the iPhone almost doesn't even stand a chance here. The iPhone's details are just not that great, apparently. It's just not as sharp. You can see right here. It's a huge difference. Add to that the higher contrast on the X60, which just gives even more clarity and definition to Valentine's feathers, is just a huge win in details. Now, granted, the higher contrast also allows some of the highlights in the background and the table to blow out. But hey, overall, I do still prefer the X60 by far. It just gives such a beautiful and detailed image compared to the iPhone. As for the ultra-wide camera as well, here the difference in detail has been exemplified even more. Because if you didn't know already, the iPhone's ultra-wide sensor is not nearly as big compared to the X60. So the X60 just lets in a lot more light and it can produce a much more detailed video, even in such low light conditions. It's a pretty huge win in my opinion, and see, this is exactly why I think that the iPhone really needs a hardware improvement over anything else, because they have great software for video, the processing and all that, it's nice. But the hardware difference, it has essentially caught up, and it's really resulted in leaving the iPhones basically in the dust in numerous cases like these. Now to top it all off, the X60 also has night mode video. Now there are a few quirks to this, I want to say, because firstly it's 1080p30, so you're losing out on the details of 4K, and on top of that there's a heavy amount of noise reduction going on. So that does mean that you're gonna get less details, but also fairly less noise in the video right here. There's also a little bit higher brightness compared to the videos from the X60 we saw before. So yeah, you're just gonna have to use it depending on the situation you're in. Now for night mode time-lapse, unlike the previous situations, is a place where the iPhone takes an easy win. The X60 obviously doesn't even come close. It's 1080p and it has no night mode time-lapse. Overall, it's not as good as the iPhone as you'd expect. Now finally, for slow motion, both can do 1080p 240, and overall, I like the X60 here once again, and for a very simple reason. The iPhone trying to maintain all the shadow detail lowers the contrast, and that just doesn't give the amount of perceived detail as the X60. It's very simple really, and quite interesting to see such a weird trend here. Anyways, that's it for the camera comparison. I do think that the X60 is pretty good, and it's nice to see that 4K 60 problem with stabilization that we had before, it's apparently been fixed without me knowing anything. But anyways, yeah, I think that the iPhone is a little bit more consistent in daylight video. Like, it handles exposure better, it has better dynamic range in almost every situation, while the X60, because of higher contrast and slightly worse dynamic range, especially in like daylight conditions, doesn't do that well. But when you come indoors and you go for even some of the harsher lighting conditions, I think the higher contrast and even in low light, the better detail preservation, it really comes into its own for the X60. It has a lot of quirks and problems, but it's also got a lot of promises, and it does have a lot of good quality to back it up. So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, do that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be seeing you guys later. Cheers.